Hey everybody, Spencer Stanley here. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about frame rates, shutter speed, and how to use these to make your videos more quote-unquote cinematic.
Soon may the weathermen come to bring us sugar and tea.
When I first started filmmaking, my friend had a Canon 1DX and we took a trip to a really close national park that wasn't too far away. I was just getting into making videos and I remember he had a ton of cool gear that I was extremely enamored by. On this trip, I remember him pulling out his 1DX with the Sigma 35mm, shooting at 120 frames per second at f1.8, and whoa! I was like immediately hooked. I wanted something that could do this, that could shoot 120 frames per second. This is what I always wanted. This immediately led me down a rabbit hole to look for cameras in this budget that I had. I don't remember what it was. It wasn't a lot. I didn't do that, so I ended up buying the Sony a7R Mark III, which I'm still using today for $4,500 plus lens and all that. I spent a lot of money. I didn't think I'd be this excited. From this moment on in my early filmmaking career, I shot almost everything at 120 frames per second. Like, I mean everything. I was shooting a lot of events and stuff like that, and I just wanted to make cool videos for my Instagram. I didn't really think about this as a business that much at this point. I was just like having fun and shooting what I wanted to shoot. So if slow motion is so badass, why even make a video about frame rates, and why not just shoot everything at 60 or 120 frames per second? Well, we really only want to use slow motion when it's emphasizing a particular shot that's gonna help tell the story better in a slow motion way. So this could be like somebody running, a car drifting, something like that. Okay, so now that we're talking about slow motion, what is frame rate? What is 24? What is 60? What is 120 frames per second? Basically, to shoot video, our cameras just take a bunch of pictures every second to make a natural looking motion. Now, the best way to visualize this is those flip books that we had as kids that would go like, so each of those pages would basically be like a frame. In NTSC standard, the standard is 24 frames per second to show normal speed, but this really has nothing about it being like the most pleasing or smooth motion to our eyes. It actually has to do with the way that movies were shown in theaters back in the day. A film projector used to be cranked to project pictures onto the screen in the theater. And when sound was introduced, they needed a way to make sure that that speed was steady with the cranking to make the sound natural and it didn't sound all over the place. So when trying to decide on a speed, they asked theaters how fast they actually cranked their films on those projectors, and some did it a little bit slower, some did it a little bit faster to finish movies quickly and make a little bit more money. So they landed on a standard of 90 feet per minute of film, which equated to about 24 frames per second today. Now, one thing to also consider is that we do find this frame rate more cinematic, but it's really just due to our conditioning over time since we've been looking at movies at 24 frames per second our whole life. You know, this is something really weird to ponder when we're talking about cinematic stuff, because like, what really is cinematic? Cinematic is just what we're used to a lot of the time and what movies have kind of portrayed. All right, so when do we want to use slow motion? A lot of people are using slow motion unless it really serves a purpose, like I explained earlier, of someone either running or maybe a car drifting around a corner. Honestly, I think it has a lot of purpose beyond that as well. I think it works really good in event videos or recap videos. It gives an almost dreamlike look to a lot of footage, but I think it needs to be well balanced. A lot of people will shoot everything in 60 frames per second when they're starting out, like myself. The first camera or the second camera I got, and when I was vlogging, I shot everything in 60 frames per second. But this is the wrong approach. The idea behind this is that you could throw a 60 frame per second clip in a 24 frame per second timeline and just play it as if it was normal speed. But there are a bunch of problems that come with it. The biggest problem is that it doesn't follow the 180-degree shutter rule. All right, so what is the 180-degree shutter rule? Well, when filming video, we want it to look as natural and cinematic as possible, even if we've been a little conditioned to do so. To do this, we want a natural amount of motion blur like our eyes see when we're waving anything in front of us, so we don't get that soap opera effect that a lot of beginners tend to accidentally achieve when they're messing with their shutter rate a little too much. Now, I'm not gonna get too nerdy with the technical specs of why we shoot at 180-degree shutter angle. If you're interested, Gelled Undone has an amazing video that explains this, and I even had my eyes opened a little bit to some of the differences in different shutter speeds and kind of why we're using these shutter speeds in the first place. Now, the easiest way to explain this rule is to double our shutter speed compared to our frame rate to achieve the most natural look. So if we're shooting in 24 frames per second, we want our shutter to be around 1/50. If we're shooting in 60 frames, we want it to be 1/20, and if we're shooting in 120 frames, we want it to be 1/24, and so on. So I still haven't answered that question of why not shoot everything in 60 frames per second. So now that we know the 180-degree shutter angle rule, we understand that shooting everything in 60 frames per second with a 1/125 shutter speed is gonna make our footage in a 24 frame per second timeline not slowed down, look choppy. So if we're not slowing down that 60 frame per second footage, there's too much of a shutter. Now there are always ways to get around this, but the best practice is to just adjust your camera settings and be extremely thoughtful when you film video. If you really wanna be lazy, you could always shoot in 60 frames per second and change your shutter speed to 1/60 when you know you won't be slowing down the footage. And even with this, you could still slow it down in post, but it's gonna have a weird amount of motion blur, which maybe you want, maybe you don't. We don't always have to follow the rules, but if we're shooting in that 60 frames per second all the time and you wanna shoot slow motion, you can just change your shutter speed to 120 frames per second, and then it'll actually look really good. So you can kind of shoot 60 frames per second all the time if you really want to. I don't think this is a good practice to follow. It's also gonna lead to huge file sizes on your computer because you're always shooting 60 frames per second, which is more pictures in the video, higher file sizes, it's a nightmare. So how do I use my frame rates now when filming videos? I like to plan out my videos a lot more now and be intentional with my shots than I used to. I'm adapting my style as a filmmaker all the time, and this seems to change every year. When I know I'm not slowing down a certain shot, say an interview, I like to shoot this at 24 frames per second with a 1/50 shutter. And if I know I'm trying to achieve like a cool slow motion effect in post, I'll generally shoot in 120 frames per second with a 1/250 shutter so that my shutter angle matches both frame rates. I typically don't use 60 frames per second, but I may start playing around with it a bit just to change it up. If my camera shot 60 frames per second in 4K, I would probably prioritize this over the 120 frames per second in HG just for that extra quality because I like 4K footage. When I upgrade to the Sony FX6 in the near future, I'm excited to start implementing some more slow motion into my videos, and I'm hoping to change the look of what I'm filming a lot because I feel like it's good to always adapt and try new things. I want us to make one last note on this video and a really pro tip when it comes to exposure. So when we shoot at higher frame rates and increase our shutter, we're getting a lot less light into our cameras. If you're shooting a dark environment, you always want to prioritize your exposure. We don't want some ugly, grainy, dark shot that's not going to look good. This either means proper lighting to compensate or maybe shooting in a slower frame rate. Anyways, that's everything on frame rate today, guys. This was a fun video to make. I'm trying to script these videos out a little bit more to make them more accurate so I'm not just rambling in front of the computer. So I hope that worked. If you have any questions on frame rates, shoot them to me down below and I'll be sure to answer those for you. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button because it helps with all the work that I do with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Need 'em days, don't be shy. Nobody change.